The first one we found was embedded in a dead-weather satellite over the Indian Ocean, hull diameter 40 centimeters, alloy composition we couldn't match to any known manufacturer, no propulsion signature, no power draw, completely inert. We cataloged it as debris. We did that for 11 years. The second one turned up during the dismantling of a defunct relay platform in low orbit, 2093. Same alloy, same geometry, same nothing. The field technician who recovered it was curious enough to bring it inside rather than bag and dispose. That technician's name was Arva Yen, and if there's a record anywhere of what she actually began, it's probably buried in a maintenance log that nobody reads anymore. She spent 4 months on that unit before she cracked the passive suppression field inside it, a narrowband emitter, tuned precisely to the frequency range that human orbital launch systems used in the late 21st century. It wasn't debris. It was a cork in a bottle. By 2097, we had recovered 63 of them. By 2103, over 400. The total count, when we finally mapped the constellation properly, was 1,407. They had been seeded across Earth's orbital shell in an interlocking suppression net overlapping coverage, no gap wider than 300 kilometers, designed so that any launch vehicle achieving stable low orbit would enter a suppression envelope within minutes and lose navigational coherence. Not destruction, not an attack we could point to, just a quiet, technical ceiling, a hand pressed down on the top of our heads. We calculated the deployment date at approximately 2007 by Earth reckoning. At that time, humanity had one operational space station, no interstellar capability, and no way to detect what had just been done to us. We had been flying under a leash for 80 years before we found the first node. By the time we understood the full architecture, we had been living inside it for nearly a century and a half. I was assigned to the Shepherd Recovery and Integration Project in 2187, when I was 31 years old. That's what we called it internally, the project. Not publicly. Publicly, the recovered units were classified as legacy alien commercial telemetry equipment under long-term passive monitoring agreements with uncontacted species, which was a statement of such spectacular dishonesty that the people who drafted it must have felt something. I have no evidence they did. The political decision to do anything other than quietly decommission the units was not made quickly. There were people, senior people, people whose names appear in the historical record with the kind of frequency that suggests they were listened to, who argued that the correct response was disclosure, make the constellation public, name the Vethkin Collective as the architects, and let the weight of galactic opinion do its work. There were others who argued for quiet dismantlement and nothing further, on the grounds that provoking a civilization 3 centuries ahead of us in development was tactically foolish. Both positions had their adherents, and the debate ran, in various institutional forms, for nearly 40 years. What ended it was simple arithmetic. By 2183 we had achieved interstellar capability. We were no longer the species the Vethkin Collective had corked. The ceiling they had installed was no longer a ceiling, it was evidence. And evidence, as one of the project's early directors once noted in a memo that I have read many times, does not expire. My job was weapons integration. Specifically, take the suppression emitters out, understand the power architecture, and determine whether the housing and the transmission system could be repurposed. The answer, which took my team 11 years to confirm with any confidence, was yes. The Shepherd units were built to last. Whatever the Vethkin Collective had been as a civilization, and by 2187 we had a partial picture, enough to know they were old, large, and comfortable with arrangements they expected to be permanent. They had built their tools to outlast the problem, the irony being that they outlasted the solution. We did not reverse engineer the suppression field. We stripped it. What we kept was the chassis, the power cell architecture, the tight beam transmission array, and the autonomous station keeping system. 4 centuries of drift and the units had maintained their orbital positions to within 11 meters. That is not an accident of design. That is a civilization that builds to last and does not expect to be argued with. We added our own guidance package, our own warhead, and we retuned the transmission array to broadcast on the original Vethkin activation frequency. The same handshake signal the shepherds had been passively waiting to receive for 300 years, the signal that would tell them they were home, that their operators were near, that all was as intended. We never transmitted that signal to them, we saved it. The fleet that assembled at the Jovian staging point in March of 2317 was not large by the standards of what came later in this century, but it was what we had, and it was enough. 220 warships of Earth, frigates, destroyers, 3 cruisers, the flagship Corval, carrying in their dorsal launch bays 1,407 rebuilt Shepherd units, each one catalogued by recovery date and original orbital position, each one carrying the handshake signal in its transmission buffer, ready to broadcast on separation from the bay. I was aboard the Corval as technical liaison. It was not a combat role. My job was to certify the Shepherd units for deployment and to observe, record, and verify. I had spent 30 years on this project. I was not going to watch it from Earth. We crossed into Vethkin space on a Tuesday. I remember because I had noted the day in my log as a formality, and the word Tuesday looked strange against the coordinates. The Vethkin home system was where we expected it. They had not moved, had not restructured, had not apparently considered that the arrangement might one day require defending. There was a patrol perimeter. There was a challenge transmission. Our communications officer logged it as received and did not respond. Fleet Admiral Oren gave the deployment order at 4:10 system local time. The Shepherd units left the dorsal bays in groups of 50, standard spacing, standard formation. Each one on separation broadcast the Vethkin activation handshake on the original frequency. The signal that said, "Hello, we know you, you are recognized, approach is authorized." The Vethkin patrol net received those signals and read them correctly. 1,407 units, broadcasting authentication codes that were 3 centuries old and had never been used, because they had never needed to be used. Because the units were supposed to sit quietly above a pre-spaceflight world and do their work without announcement. The Vethkin patrol response to the handshake was to open a corridor. Standard procedure for returning autonomous equipment, I assume. I don't know their protocols. I know the corridor opened. The Shepherds went home. I watched the engagement on the tactical display. That is too dramatic a word for what it was. Engagement implies 2 sides. The Shepherd units were autonomous, fast, and guided by a targeting architecture we had spent 30 years refining. The Vethkin patrol perimeter had been designed to handle incoming threats, not authenticated returning equipment broadcasting known credentials from inside the corridor. There was a gap between recognition and reclassification that lasted, by my count, 41 seconds. In 41 seconds, 830 Shepherd units had already completed their first targeting pass. The fleet held position. We were not needed. By 5:03 system local time, the engagement was complete. I use the word because the log requires a word. The Vethkin Collective transmitted on open frequency at 5:11, a distress query, structured as a request for clarification on the nature and authorization of the returning units. It was sent in 4 languages, including 2 human trade dialects, which told me they understood exactly what had happened and had chosen the phrasing of the transmission carefully. I logged it as received at 5:12. Fleet Admiral Oren did not respond. That was the order: no response, no statement, no declaration. There was nothing to declare. The Vethkin Collective had conducted an authorized suppression operation against Earth in 2007, deploying 1,407 autonomous units into our orbital shell without notice, without consent, and without the diplomatic standing to make such a decision unilateral. We had recovered those units. We had returned them. The matter was, as of 5:03, resolved. I filed the technical certification report at 642 pages, every Shepherd unit accounted for, recovery date, integration modifications, deployment confirmation, engagement telemetry, terminal verification. The last line of the summary section read, all 1,407 units confirmed expended. Return payload 0. Modification program complete. I put the report in the prior action tray, which is what the fleet's record system called the archive for concluded operations. I had never used that tray before. I did not know anyone who had. The Corville began its burn for home at 700. I went below decks and found the small commissary that the engineering crews used and poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down. Arva Yen had been dead for 60 years. I had never met her. I thought about the field technician who had been curious enough to bring a 40-centimeter piece of unknown alloy inside rather than bag it and dispose of it, and what she had started, and how long it had taken, and how it had ended. The coffee was bad. The kind that tastes like the machine has been apologizing for itself for years and hasn't improved. I drank it and went back to work.